have a few people joining us as we move through this, but I just want a couple of quick reminders. Please use the Q&A feature during this to ask any questions that you may have. We will have some questions, just some poll questions coming up in that Q&A box there throughout the webinar. So please feel free to participate in that. Use that polling feature as those pop up. But thank you everyone for joining us. We're really excited to be putting on the North Carolina Friendly Driver Program virtual version of this for you as part of a pre-conference webinar for our summit that's taking place in Chapel Hill starting Sunday, running through Tuesday of next week. So hopefully we'll see quite a few of you at that event. But for those of you who are unable to attend that event, we're excited that you're able to be a part of this virtual presentation of the Friendly Driver Program. So for those unfamiliar with the Friendly Driver Program, it's the presentation that we put on throughout the state, educating drivers on how to safely share the road with vulnerable road users. What we will go through today, we're going to go through quite a few sections here. We'll give a little bit of an introduction to the program. We're going to talk about sharing the road with vulnerable road users. That term, vulnerable road user, what that means, who qualifies as a vulnerable road user, and what that looks like in sharing the road. We'll talk about the consequence of error, what that phrase means, and how that applies to driving with vulnerable road users. Talk about controlling the lane. This applies to cyclists. And when cyclists may choose to control the lane or take the lane, we will use those terms interchangeably. With this being focusing both on bicycles and pedestrians, we will talk about pedestrian walkability quite a bit, and some aspects of that as it relates to vulnerable road users and interactions with drivers on the road. We'll go over some standard driving principles. We do teach this class to a lot of driver's ed programs, so it's fresh in a lot of their memories or fresh in their minds, but I think it's always valuable to refresh some common sense driving principles and how those apply not just to other drivers on the road, but to bicycles and pedestrians as well. We'll talk about some common crash types, the impacts of those on bicycles, pedestrians, both throughout the state, nationally, and some of principles on obviously avoiding those crashes. And then finally, we'll talk about reducing conflict through better design, some of the complete streets ideas, and applying those to road design and city design to ensure that we are creating roadways that are safe for all road users. So for those of you unfamiliar with Bike Walk North Carolina, our mission is to lead and support, inspire educational efforts throughout the state that create an environment that fairly, equitably, safely provides for human-powered transportation, bicycles, pedestrians on our roadways, and keeping those vulnerable road users safe. This program is funded directly through a grant from the Governor's Highway Safety Program, as well as work closely with other organizations and grantees throughout the state. North Carolina Vision Zero, Watch for Me are just a few of those. And I'm going to jump back and talk about this again. I mentioned that this is geared towards drivers. That's a key part of this. The outreach that we do is to get this program in front of as many drivers as possible. We do present this to bicycle advocacy groups and other organizations, people who are avid cyclists and pedestrians out there on the roads, but this is geared towards primarily drivers, but as bicyclists and pedestrians, many of us are drivers as well. So although we may be on the road on bikes and walking, it is good. It's good practice to have refreshers and understand those rules of the road for drivers as well. So this program, again, we present this program throughout the state. However, we do have 7 priority counties. Those are the ones listed there: Cumberland, Durham, Forsyth, Guilford, Mecklenburg, New Hanover, and Wake. Obviously, we're talking about there Fayetteville, Durham, Winston-Salem, Greensboro, and the like. Those are the areas with the highest crash rates. However, we do present the program throughout the state. We've done programs from the far eastern portion of the state to the west. So if we'll have some time at the end, we'll share some contact information. If you would like to have this program presented in your area, please feel free to contact us and we can tailor it to any audience. So essentially, why this course? Everyone is entitled to the same roads: bicycles, pedestrians, drivers. These roadways are used by all manner of active and motorized transportation, and sharing the road is essential. We're all on those roads together, and we're all trying to reach our destination safely. And through this program, we like to teach the best practices for driving safely, especially in areas where bicyclists, pedestrians, and other vulnerable road users may be present. And we'll talk about more specifically what areas you may see those, and the impacts of having bicycles and pedestrians while driving, or in those areas while driving. So unfortunately, crashes do happen all over the state of North Carolina. Each year, approximately 1,000 crashes involve a person on a bicycle and a motorist each year. 60 of those involve serious injury to the bicyclist. And on average, about 20 people each year are killed on bicycles in North Carolina, with children and young adults being the most frequent victims of that. So who is considered to be a vulnerable road user? We'll use this term quite a bit. Obviously, with us being Bike Walk North Carolina, we focus on the pedestrian and bicyclist, but especially if you're in cities or around college campuses, there are those electric scooters, skateboards, wheelchairs, roadway workers are often overlooked, and even motorcycles, because as you'll see there in the definition, vulnerable road user describes those unprotected by an outside shield that have a greater risk of sustaining serious injury in a collision. So that is the definition there. And so obviously that includes the bicycles and pedestrians, but also those other roadway users that would be considered vulnerable. I'm going to stop or pause at a couple points throughout this and really highlight a number of pieces that will be key takeaways from this presentation. This being the first one. In North Carolina, in the state of North Carolina, by law, a bicycle is a vehicle. And you'll see there the poll question. Chime in there, but as a vehicle, a bicycle is entitled to use the full lane. So that is one of those key takeaways. We have bike lanes. You will see cyclists right on the shoulders of the road, but bicyclists are entitled to the full lane, and we'll talk about when and why they may choose to use that full lane of travel. So, consequence of error. We're going to talk about this several points throughout this presentation, but consequences of error speaks to, if you're driving down the road at a slow rate of speed, and you were to be distracted for a minute and swerve, hit a trash can on the side of the road, something like that. The error there is it's a small error, with very little consequence. However, that same mistake in the presence of a bicycle or a pedestrian, the consequence of those errors are greatly increased. So while a fender bender in a car at 10, 20 miles an hour may be considered just that, a minor accident, that same accident, when involving a bicycle and pedestrian or any vulnerable road user, the consequences of those errors skyrocket. And we'll talk about just what some key points of that, and especially as it relates to speed. Just the as speed increases, just what the impact of that is with bicycles and pedestrians, and the injuries and fatalities related to that. So, as drivers, many drivers are guilty of texting and driving. The just having 2 beers after work, happy hour, that sort of thing. Wanting to change songs on a playlist. Weaving in and out of traffic. We have here treating traffic as a personal game of Tetris. These are all risk behaviors that are increase the likelihood of error and thus increase the consequence of error. And again, I mentioned that driving just 5 miles an hour over the speed limit, that seriously increases your risk of error and the consequences of error. And even if we don't do these things, we still drive on narrow, windy roads. I live up in the mountains. We don't have, the country road that I live on doesn't have a lot of bicycles and pedestrians, but we do have, or we don't have, stoplights and crosswalks, but, we do drive around narrow roads, around blind curbs. So whether you're driving in a city or a rural area, you can encounter bicycles and pedestrians. And again, where those bicycles and pedestrians are present, we're seriously increasing the consequence of those errors. So as I mentioned, as a vehicle in the state of North Carolina, bicycles are entitled to control the lane. We have here 2 signs. These 2 signs, we have the yellow sign and the white sign there. Many of you are probably familiar with seeing each of these more often, or we hope to see more often, those white signs. Because the difference between those 2 signs, as you see there in the poll, the difference between those 2 signs is actually that yellow sign is a cautionary sign versus the white sign is a regulatory sign, meaning there are consequences to not obeying that white sign that there wouldn't be to following the laws of that yellow sign. Again, also the meaning between those 2 signs, sharing the road, that's something that can mean to drivers that you may look at a situation where a cyclist is riding on the right-hand side of the road or right-hand side of the lane, and you may look to kind of squeeze past a cyclist or make unsafe passing maneuvers. Whereas that sign, the may use full lane sign, is a little bit more clear in its communication to drivers that bicycles may not just be present, but they are entitled to that same space on the road that the drivers are. So here are some key examples of what sharing the road may look like. You can see in this picture some examples of when a cyclist may choose to use the lane. So you'll see there there are cracks in the sidewalks, puddles. I joke, or I don't joke. This is I often state that there's a particular bike lane in Raleigh. I don't know if any of the attendees here tonight are from Raleigh, but along Crabtree Boulevard, there's a section of Greenway that runs close to that, and there's a bike lane along Crabtree Boulevard that's actually a buffered bike lane, meaning it has bollards separating the traffic, not just a line on the road. But every time I've ridden on that, there's been glass in that bike lane. I've gotten one flat tire in that bike lane and known another person to get another flat tire on a ride with me in that bike lane. So although I ride that section of road fairly often, I do not use the bike lane there just because of the risk of getting a flat tire. There is broken glass. But you can see here in the picture, there are a number of other considerations and situations in which a cyclist may choose to use that bike lane. Obviously, there we have a car parked in the bike lane. That is a all too common occurrence. So an opportunity or an instance there where a cyclist may choose to ride outside of the bike lane to avoid that. Also avoiding that door zone when you have cars parked parallel, especially in city centers, college areas, areas where there's parallel parking on a city street where there is also a bike lane present. There is that space where a car parked parallel, their door will open into a bike lane. And while very, not commonly a fatal accident or a fatal crash, between a car and a bicycle, these can be much more serious injuries than people often realize. So another point there made in this diagram is making a left turn. So if they're approaching an intersection and they're riding in the bike lane, they're going to want to take that lane in order to merge left and make a left turn at an intersection. So next up, we're going to talk about why. You'll see there in the poll question, that's a good one there. So why people ride two abreast. So oftentimes a lot of the pushback or response that cyclists receive from drivers is, they're riding 3 wide, 2 wide, taking up the whole lane. Well, there are reasons for that. First off, it makes cyclists more visible to drivers. It deters drivers from making unsafe passes. So it forces drivers to change lanes to pass versus trying to squeeze through in the remaining lane space if a cyclist is riding all the way to the right-hand side. With the size of vehicles now, that space is pretty limited as far as riding a cyclist and a motor vehicle side by side and still staying in the lane of travel. So it does force drivers to change lanes to pass. In this scenario here, you'll see it's on a double yellow line. And as that poll question that came up suggests, it is legal, again, legal to pass cyclists on a double yellow line in North Carolina, so long as it is, you have full clear view to pass, and you indicate your intention, pass safely, and return to the lane of travel you came from. In this situation here, in this picture, in this diagram, you'll see that you have a good line of sight there. You can see that there's no oncoming traffic. So a driver approaching this group of cyclists from behind could make clear that that is a safe opportunity to pass, make that pass, and do so legally. The other advantage to riding two abreast is actually an advantage to the driver as well. And that is that it decreases the distance that it takes to pass that group of cyclists. If you're approaching a group of cyclists from behind, a group of 12 cyclists, you're now only needing to pass 6 rather than all 12 in a line. One little anecdote that I like to share: there is one road in the state of North Carolina where it is not legal to ride two abreast, and I know this because I was pulled over for doing so, and that is the Blue Ridge Parkway. That rule was established, I'm not sure how far back when the parkway was established or shortly thereafter, but it does state that cyclists must ride single file and as far right of the lane as possible. So while both North Carolina and Virginia allow for riding two abreast, if you're ever on the parkway, just be aware that you may get pulled over if riding two abreast. So all right, and as I mentioned, we don't want to just talk about cyclists. We do. There's definitely a lot to cover here as far as pedestrian walkability and sharing the road and learning some about the rules that apply there. So we'll talk about what a mid-block crossing is versus jaywalking. And jaywalking is a label. You know, we don't like to apply labels to a lot of things, people's genders, things like that. Jaywalking is a outdated and, you know, somewhat derogatory term, left over from um, uh, you know, a long time ago. And so there are mid-block crossings that are not jaywalking, and there is no explicit law in North Carolina prohibiting mid-block crossings. Mid-block crossings you have two types of mid-block crossing, obviously marked and unmarked mid-block crossing. A marked mid-block crossing that you see here on the left-hand side of this picture, in a situation there, although outside of an intersection, a controlled intersection, when you do see a marked mid-block crossing such as this, it is the driver's responsibility to stop and yield to pedestrians in that crosswalk, although it is outside of an intersection. When there is an unmarked mid-block crossing, the pedestrian may cross so long as they look both ways. So long as they look both ways and deem it safe to cross, they are legally allowed to do so. So what I share with especially the young drivers there, you know, when we're presenting this program to driver's ed students, is if you see an individual looking both ways and facing a street, assume they're going to cross, and the polite thing to do there is just to let them cross, give them space, yield to them regardless. But just know that it is legal to cross outside of a marked intersection in North Carolina, so long as the pedestrian deems it safe to do so. And within those marked mid-block crossings, drivers are legally required to yield to pedestrians in that situation. These are the state statutes that use a lot of words to describe what I just said, but again, crossing in and out, or crossing at crosswalks and outside of marked intersections or controlled intersections. All right. We're going to talk about some of these common sense driving principles. Again, as I mentioned, we teach this class or present this program to driver's ed students. This is all fresh in everyone's mind in those classes, but scanning, yielding, signaling, and slowing down. And I will emphasize again the slowing down. These are those principles that are going to keep you as a driver safe and keep bicycles and pedestrians around you safe as well. So a good driver will like to see 10 to 15 seconds ahead of them on the roadway. In this description here, it says that that's about one city block. However, my response to that is, as speed increases, that gets gets to be a much greater distance. So scanning a long way down the road, this involves looking out for bicycles, pedestrians, other drivers, making note of those, being aware of those, and anticipating what those vulnerable road users may do, or actions they may take, and whether it be taking the lane in the case of a cyclist, or as a pedestrian crossing the street, anticipating behaviors of those vulnerable road users, as well as the drivers around you. You know, we don't want to, the primary focus of this presentation is on the bicycles and pedestrians, but these same rules apply when making just being a safer driver in general. So here's a couple of examples here in this diagram as it pertains to scanning. So scanning not only means looking down the road ahead of you, but also looking in mirrors. So I like to use the example of both car number 5 in this situation on the left and car number 2. Both of those drivers, when scanning properly, will make note of, or should be able to make note of, cyclists behind them in those side view mirrors. And you can see by lane positioning, that's something else that we talked about taking the lane, but a behavior that cyclists will often do is positioning themselves in a lane so that they are most visible to the drivers around them. So another key scanning example in this is car number 3 making that looks to be in a center turn lane, making a left turn into that into what looks to be a driveway there. This applies, and we'll touch on this again, but there's 2 common cycling accidents that we've covered: the Doring crash scenario, but also the left hook and the right cross. So a left cross accident, or crash rather, would take place if this car number 3 was to turn left directly in front of that cyclist, not whether it be to try and beat them to that intersection, or if they were to misjudge the speed of that cyclist. That's a common crash that takes place, is that left cross turning in front of a cyclist. Another common crash is that right hook. So in this scenario, if there was to be, whether it be car number 2 there or the white car, passing a cyclist only to then immediately turn right, that would be called the right hook crash. If you're ever following a cyclist and you're making a right turn, let that cyclist pass the intersection that you're turning into, rather than passing a cyclist just to immediately slam on the brakes and turn right. Again, that's the right hook crash, and that is a very common crash and often results in serious injury. Yes, left turn, speaking of just mentioning that, so that car number 3 left turn yields to all vehicles and pedestrians. So if there's a pedestrian in that crossing that street or on the sidewalk there, that individual in car 3 yields to all vehicles. Obviously, that includes bicycles and pedestrians. So yielding, obviously we yield at those intersections that have the sign that asks us to do so, but we yield to slower moving traffic ahead of us, yielding to oncoming traffic when turning left. That again, anytime you're turning left, you're yielding to all vehicles outside of a turn arrow, an arrow light at an intersection, always yielding to vehicles and pedestrians when turning left. Yielding to others when changing lanes. This includes bicycles, obviously, as vehicles, and yielding to people in crosswalks. We'll talk a little bit about signals that cyclists may use to indicate when changing lanes. So talked about yielding when making a right turn, a left turn, but also yielding when making a right turn. So in this scenario, obviously this individual crossing the street there with a green light in that direction of travel for the car, that individual there in the crosswalk will also have the walk signal. So when making a right turn, we're not just making right turns, we're yielding to pedestrians when making right turns. The other example I like to use in this picture is if this light were to be red, we are allowed to make a right turn on red in North Carolina, except where explicitly directed not to. Our attention often turns to the left when making a right turn, looking for vehicles that may be approaching from the left. But we also need to be aware of pedestrians crossing streets and crossing intersections in those scenarios, and making sure that we're scanning and yielding to pedestrians at intersections, even when making a right on red. So obviously, honoring signals. We like to think that everybody uses their turn signal 100% of the time, but we know that is seldom the case. But as it is required of vehicles to make signals and signal their intent, it is also required that bicycles do the same. So we have some examples here of signals that bicycles will use. So you have obviously pointing to the right, turning right, pointing to the left, turning left, a hand lowered, a left hand lowered or right hand lowered. This will sometimes be a hand behind the back in that same manner, meaning stopping or slowing down. And then you'll see there in the question, but also there in the image as well, you have the left hand raised at a right angle like that, meaning a right turn. I like to inform people. It's a fun little anecdote to learn where that comes from. That is actually a holdover from before cars had turn signals. A driver could stick their hand out of the window to indicate a left turn, but obviously they wouldn't be able to point to the right. They'd just be pointing into the passenger seat. So a left arm extended and raised up would indicate a right turn back before cars had turn signals. So that is a leftover from that time period. Both that raised left hand and pointing to the right, both are equally often used and equally valid signals for bicycles for turning right. So you will see there in the poll there's a question. So think about that question. We're going to talk about it on this next slide. Again, there are a few slides that I'll mention that are key takeaways for me that I try and if you learn nothing else from this class, you know, these key takeaways are the same, or the most valuable. And that is, we talked about one of those driving principles is slowing down, and just what that means. So here in this diagram, you'll see, you know, the difference between driving 20 miles an hour and 30 miles an hour. Where we see 20-mile-an-hour speed limits, you know, there's reasons for those being 20-mile-an-hour speed limits. It's when you are in school zones, when you are in neighborhoods, when you're in city centers. All of these places are places where you will see greater concentrations of bicycles and pedestrians and parked cars. You know, sometimes people don't recognize themselves or identify themselves as pedestrians. But if you were to drive to downtown Raleigh and park your car on a street and then walk to a restaurant, you are a pedestrian, even though you are not necessarily walking to work or walking to school as your primary means of transportation. You become a pedestrian in that situation. And I mentioned earlier that just 5 miles an hour over or just 9 miles an hour over, you know, I've heard at times, you know, when I was learning to drive and growing up, oh, if you're going just 9 miles an hour over, you know, you're probably not going to get a ticket. And if you do, it's, you know, it's not going to be too big of a hit on your insurance. But that ignores why those speed limits are in place. That, and also going 9 miles an hour over the speed limit at 70 miles an hour, that is it's not a high percentage of that total speed. But at 20 miles an hour, going 9 miles an hour is a 50% increase in your speed almost. And as you can see in this picture, you are 4 times more likely to kill a pedestrian in a crash at 30 miles an hour than you are at 20 miles an hour. So that is a key takeaway and something to always keep in mind when you're driving in a school zone or downtown or through a neighborhood. If that speed limit is 20 miles an hour, it's 20 miles an hour for a reason, and should be followed to the letter. or I guess to the number in this case, but you know, at just going that 9 miles an hour over, 10 miles an hour over in that school zone or in that neighborhood, whether where there are children, whether where there are pedestrians present, you are increasing your chance fourfold of killing a pedestrian if there were to be a crash. Likewise, you know, we all know that vehicles are getting considerably larger. Um, Trucks especially. I drive a pickup truck. I'm aware what that means as far as the size of my vehicle and the potential consequence of error. Again, of driving that vehicle in a crash. So I'm no physics wizard, but you know, you see there joules of force. Basically, you know, the takeaway from that is if you double the size of a vehicle, you double the force of impact. So, um, you know, being struck by a small sedan versus a large pickup truck could be the difference of life and death for a pedestrian very easily. And not only that, um, not just the force involved, but where that force is in that impact takes place. You see there in the diagram that a high hood on a full-size pickup truck or full-size SUV is going to strike a pedestrian in the chest, torso, vital organs versus being struck in the legs. Not only that, but greatly increases the risk of being pulled under a vehicle versus thrown onto the hood of a vehicle. You know, I say when presenting this, neither of these situations is something I want to be a part of. But the likelihood of me surviving being struck by a sedan and put onto the hood of a vehicle versus being pulled under an SUV, there's a much higher likelihood of survival with that sedan. So these are choices that we make when we shop for vehicles. And again, like I said, I drive a pickup truck. I'm aware of that consequence, but I keep that in mind when I drive. So here's some common crash types between cyclists and motorists. So there's quite a few numbers on that chart there. But you will see from that chart the most common crash between motor vehicle and cyclist is while overtaking. We talked about passing earlier a little bit when we talked about why cyclists ride two abreast, but this is a key takeaway as well, is that you know, that is the most common crash type. We've talked about dooring, we've talked about that right hook and left cross crash, but when overtaking a cyclist, that is the most common crash type. So again, talking about that left cross, avoid being right hooked. We talked about that common crash as well. But you'll see there in that diagram that again emphasizes that all drivers turning left must yield to oncoming traffic and pedestrians. So as I mentioned before, passing a person on a bike, you know, look ahead and behind to determine when it's safe to pass, signal to alert drivers of your intent. Once you have passed safely, slow down to allow back into your lane. What that means when passing a person on a bicycle. So 2 feet is the legal minimum when passing a person on a bicycle. Anything less is illegal. So against the law, 4 feet is the preferred minimum. and it is the legally required minimum when passing a person on a bike on a double yellow line. So if that 4 feet, given the size of vehicle and the space a cyclist would occupy on the right-hand side of the road, a 4 feet minimum passing requirement translates to just changing lanes to pass, and that being the safest option for both the motorist and the cyclist. So we'll talk a little bit now about reducing conflict through better design. So complete streets, I know many here on in our Zoom today maybe either bicycle advocates or professional planners or city officials who are aware of what the complete streets concept is. But what we try and share with folks is what that means as far as a complete street being designed for all roadway users. So, we think about roadways and streets, cars primarily, but a complete street provides safe and accessible transportation for all roadway users, in particular the vulnerable roadway users. So in this example here, you'll see we have wide sidewalks, we have on-street parking, we've got well-marked crosswalks, as well as bicycle lanes again. One thing this leaves out that I see I'm in Washington, D.C. fairly often, but complete streets up there include lanes exclusively for buses and bicycles. So separating usages makes it safer. And this is what, while we see these most often in cities and towns, just applying those concepts on all roadways makes for a safer environment for all roadway users. So got another poll there if you want to jump in there, but we have or we see more often bike lanes in our cities or as part of complete street efforts in many cities and towns around North Carolina. We're seeing bike lanes more often. You'll see there in the center bottom, that is a two-way bike lane on a one-way street. And you'll see again what we'd consider a buffered bike lane with those bollards separating usages, making it that much safer and that much more visible for motor vehicle drivers to see that is separated infrastructure there. That broken green line on that upper right, there's the poll question about that. But that signifies to those entering that roadway at an intersection. So if a person was approaching that roadway from the right-hand side, you may see some broken green lines, whereas if that was just a regular bike lane there, it might not be as visible to somebody entering that roadway. But that also indicates area of potential conflict of vehicles potentially crossing that bike lane. So it alerts the cyclists that vehicles may be crossing, but also alerts drivers that there are cyclists present on that roadway. So we do see green paint being applied more in bicycle lanes just to make them more visible to drivers and make cyclists that potentially feel a little bit more higher level of comfort in riding in those spaces. And please, if you haven't yet, and if you have any Q&A or questions, please drop those in the Q&A. We're happy to answer those. We're getting towards the end here, but as we wrap up, but also at any point, if you've got a question, please feel free to drop it in there and we can answer it for you. And then finally, in this example, we have there on the bottom right, the Sharrow. Um, these are, again, a fairly common roadway marking. I like to tell people that that does not indicate that bicycles are legal in that space. Bicycles are legal on all roadways, other than controlled access highways in North Carolina. So it's not indicating that bicycles are illegal. It just indicates that there's a higher likelihood of bicycles being present and alerts drivers there that cyclists are entitled to that full lane where there is no bicycle lane present. So again, these are common pieces of bicycle infrastructure that we see predominantly in North Carolina and elsewhere. But always good to see this emerging more and part of those complete street concepts. So again, I said, I'm going to touch on these key takeaways throughout the presentation. But to reiterate those, so if you don't take anything else from this presentation, this is what you should come away with, and that is treat people on bicycles as drivers of vehicles. People on bicycles may use the full lane. They are entitled as vehicles to utilize the full lane of travel. Scan, yield, signal, and again, slow down. That slide for me that is the most impactful, is that piece, that 20-mile-an-hour versus 30-mile-an-hour speed limit. When cyclists are in those slower speed zones around schools, around neighborhoods, in city centers and city or town centers, there are greater likelihoods of bicycles and pedestrians being present, and that's why those speeds are reduced in those areas. Slowing down saves lives. From that example, 20 miles an hour to 30 miles an hour, you're 4 times more likely to kill somebody at that 30 miles an hour. So pay attention at intersections and when passing. Again, intersections are an example of sort of those conflict zones and a higher likelihood of crashes taking place. And when passing a cyclist, because that is the most common crash type between a motor vehicle and a bicycle is when passing. And the safest way to pass a person on a bike is to change lanes. And then finally, all roadway users are people. These are folks, mothers, fathers, brothers, sisters, children, all trying to get to their destination safely. These are not just, these are, we have people who ride bicycles for recreation, but we also have people who ride bicycles and walk because that is their primary means of transportation, whether they choose to or whether their economic status dictates that they cannot afford a car. Whether they choose to or not. If they're using a bicycle or walking as transportation, they deserve the same rights to get to where they are going safely as drivers do. So being vulnerable road users, again, outside the shield of that shell of the vehicle, the consequence of error increases greatly for crashes involving bicycles and pedestrians. So as I mentioned, there are some our websites are there. We also have information or contact information. Again, as we wrap up, I want to remind everyone this is a modified presentation of the Friendly Driver Program, focused on driver behavior outlined in the DMV handbook. But if you have any questions, please feel free to drop those in the chat. But again, this is a modified version of that presentation. We can tailor this presentation to any audience. We've presented this to school bus drivers. We have presented this to driver's ed programs. We have presented this to city bus drivers. We have presented this to police departments, bicycle advocacy organizations, the general public. So please feel free to reach out and contact us if you're interested in hosting one of these in your area. But again, as we wrap up, I'll give a few minutes if anybody wants to drop any questions in the chat. But again, thank you for participating in the program, and we hope to see many of you at the summit next week in Chapel Hill. All right. Again, any questions? If not, again, thank you for showing up, and we will be wrapping up now.